who Ben Robert Smith is: a war criminal, a bully, and a liar.
A Victoria Cross recipient walked into a courtroom intending to clear his name. Instead, the trial became Australia's most watched case as allegations of war crimes were systematically proven true. This is the Ben Robert Smith trial. It ran for 110 days. It cost an estimated $25 million. A 726-page judgment detailed allegations that a decorated soldier murdered unarmed Afghan prisoners during Special Forces operations between 2006 and 2012. The nation watched as witnesses testified about kicking a man off a cliff, shooting captured fighters, and ordering executions. By the end, Robert Smith's reputation didn't survive the courtroom. Not because the judge was biased, but because the journalists got the facts right. This is a story about what happens when a powerful person with nothing to hide decides to sue for defamation anyway. It's about how the legal system can expose truths that the court wasn't originally designed to expose. It's about why suing to protect your reputation sometimes does the opposite. You need to watch because understanding this trial reveals something crucial about how defamation law actually works, why powerful people often lose these cases despite public sympathy, and what the Australian public learned about one of their most decorated soldiers. Ben Robert Smith was a war hero by any measure. Victoria Cross for Australia, Medal of Gallantry, Commendation for Distinguished Service. He was the most decorated serving member of the Australian Defence Force. After leaving the Army in 2013, he became a regional television manager, a prominent public figure in Queensland. He was trusted. He was celebrated. Then journalists started asking questions. In 2016, an official inquiry called the Brereton Report investigated allegations of unlawful killing by special forces in Afghanistan. The report was classified. The public knew something was being investigated but didn't know what. In 2018, journalists Nick McKenzie, Chris Masters, and David Wroe at Fairfax Media decided to report what they had found. The Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, and the Canberra Times published articles alleging that Robert Smith had killed unarmed Afghan prisoners and civilians. They alleged he'd ordered subordinates to commit murder. They alleged he'd bullied fellow soldiers. Robert Smith denied everything. He didn't pursue criminal charges. He didn't sit for interviews explaining his side. Instead, in August 2018, he sued Fairfax Media for defamation. His legal team argued the stories were false. They argued the witnesses against him were jealous, were lying to get revenge, were twisting isolated incidents into something they weren't. The decision to sue would prove catastrophic. Not because the court was unfair, but because defamation trials expose everything. Once litigation begins, the judge gets to decide what's admissible. The media gets to call their witnesses. Robert Smith gets to call his witnesses. Then everything that was said in the courtroom, every allegation, every piece of evidence, every adverse finding, becomes public record covered by absolute privilege. You can't sue for defamation for what gets said accurately in a courtroom that's already been reported. The trial started in January 2022. It would run for 110 days of evidence before submissions ended in July 2022. The courtroom became theater. Media outlets covered it daily. The Guardian released a podcast dedicated entirely to the case. Australians followed the testimony like a serialized drama because what emerged was genuinely shocking. Multiple serving Special Forces soldiers testified under anonymity about Robert Smith's conduct. They described incidents. They provided dates. They provided details that could be corroborated. One witness testified about an incident in 2012 in a village called Darwan. Robert Smith allegedly kicked a handcuffed Afghan man off a cliff. The man was knocked unconscious by the fall, losing teeth in the impact. Then Robert Smith allegedly shot him dead. Another witness described an incident where Robert Smith allegedly killed a man with a prosthetic leg and then took the leg as a souvenir that later became a drinking vessel passed around between soldiers. A third witness described Robert Smith ordering the shooting of a captive fighter at close range multiple times. Bullying allegations came from serving soldiers too. One testified that Robert Smith had threatened to put a bullet in the back of his head if he didn't improve performance. When that soldier reported the threat, Robert Smith allegedly threatened him again, using profane language to warn him to have proof before making accusations. Throughout the trial, Robert Smith maintained his innocence. He took the stand and testified that he'd acted within the rules of engagement. He testified that witnesses were lying. He testified that his colleagues were jealous of his medals and had fabricated evidence to destroy his reputation. His legal team argued that what had happened in Afghanistan had been warfare, that enemies had been combatants, that soldiers sometimes had to make split-second decisions. Justice Anthony Besanko listened to 110 days of testimony. He read witness statements. He examined classified material from the Brereton report. He considered the credibility of every witness. On June 1, 2023, he delivered his verdict. 4 of the 6 murder allegations were substantially true. 2 others were defended under contextual truth, meaning the proved allegations were worse than the unproved ones. The judgment was devastating. Besanko found Robert Smith had murdered 4 unarmed Afghan men. He found Robert Smith had violated the laws of war. He found Robert Smith had bullied fellow soldiers. He found Robert Smith had disgraced his country through his conduct. The 726-page judgment detailed the evidence methodically, explaining why he found witness testimony credible and Robert Smith's denials unconvincing. What made the judgment particularly damaging was the standard of proof involved. This wasn't a criminal trial requiring proof beyond reasonable doubt. This was a civil case requiring proof on the balance of probabilities. The court had to decide, was it more likely than not that Robert Smith had committed these acts? With serious allegations of criminal conduct, Australian law applies what's called the Bridgenshaw principle, which means the court needs stronger evidence proportional to the gravity of the allegation. Despite that heightened standard, Besanko found the evidence overwhelming. Robert Smith appealed. The full court of the federal court heard the appeal in February 2024 and dismissed it unanimously in May 2025. The judges agreed that the evidence was sufficiently cogent to support the findings. They said that even if there were minor errors in the trial judge's reasoning, the errors were inconsequential. The High Court of Australia then refused Robert Smith's application for special leave to appeal in September 2025, effectively ending the case. The financial cost was staggering. The trial was estimated to have cost at least $25 million, making it the most expensive defamation case in Australian legal history. Fairfax Media had to fund a multi-week trial with extensive legal representation. Robert Smith had to fund his own legal team across a trial that spanned over a year. In the end, the court could order Robert Smith to pay Fairfax's legal costs, adding millions more to his liability. But the financial cost pales compared to the reputational cost. Robert Smith resigned from 7 West Media after the initial verdict. His status as a national hero was shattered. Everything that made him admirable, his courage, his service, his medals, now existed alongside court findings that he'd murdered prisoners. The judgment had converted accusations into legal findings. The man who sued to protect his reputation ended up with his reputation destroyed by the court process itself. Journalists Nick McKenzie, Chris Masters, and David Wroe had taken a massive risk with their reporting. If they'd lost the case, they would have been financially devastated. Fairfax would have faced massive damages. The journalists themselves would have faced personal liability. But they'd done their homework. They'd interviewed witnesses. They'd verified information. They'd built a case strong enough to withstand both trial and appeal. The case created a paradox that confounded legal experts and media commentators. If a man had nothing to hide, why did he sue? If he'd committed the acts alleged, why would he pursue a public trial that would expose everything? The answer revealed something about human psychology. Robert Smith apparently believed that once he got into a courtroom, he could control the narrative. He could call witnesses. He could explain. He could show that the accusations were lies. Instead, the courtroom became the vehicle for proving him guilty. For the Australian media, the case was a watershed moment. It showed that defamation law could be used not just to silence stories but to prove them true. It showed that even powerful, decorated figures could lose these cases. For Robert Smith, the trial didn't clear his name. It enshrined allegations that were worse than if he'd simply let the journalism stand unchallenged. He spent millions, spent years, spent emotional energy, and ended up losing more than he would have by doing nothing. That paradox, that defending yourself in court sometimes destroys you worse than ignoring the accusation, is at the heart of the Robert Smith case. The case also established a precedent. For the first time in Australian legal history, a court had assessed accusations of war crimes by Australian forces. That assessment concluded that those crimes had occurred. The findings were now part of the historical record. Future courts would consider them. Future inquiries would reference them. The judicial system had done what government refused to do: make a binding determination about what happened. Robert Smith has said he might pursue further legal action. Whether he will actually do so remains unclear. But the precedent is set. The trial is complete. The judgment stands. And Australia's most decorated soldier is now most remembered for what happened in a courtroom in 2023, when a 110-day trial systematically dismantled his reputation. If you found this legal case fascinating, subscribe for more stories about how trials reveal truths that powerful people desperately want hidden. Drop a comment below. What do you think about the balance between protecting reputation through defamation law and allowing public interest journalism? Thanks for watching.